Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Progressive Bitcoiner. I'm your host, Trey Walsh, and today we have on the show Erik. Erik is a UX designer. He's worked on the cashu app that many of you might be familiar with called eNuts, and so many other projects, and has a real eye and attention for detail with UX, UI, design, and Bitcoin, being in the space for a little while now. So this was a really interesting conversation to talk about some of my favorite things involving mainstream adoption of Bitcoin, building products that folks really want to use in Bitcoin, whether it's wallets, whether it's cashu implementations of Bitcoin, focusing on design and things like that. And then also talking about politics and talking about different movements within Bitcoin, different approaches and hurdles to Bitcoin adoption and community. We talked about privacy, governments, different things like that. So this was a really good conversation. I really loved having Erik on to talk about it. And I'm sure many of you will find many different things that you're interested in this conversation, whether it's more the technical design side of things, whether it's our talking about politics and censorship resistant stuff, privacy, and hoping to get more and more away from privacy and free speech being known as right-wing talking points, which really drives me crazy, and just focusing on human flourishing and the importance of things like privacy and freedom of speech for everyone, regardless of your political leanings, and encouraging that. So thank you so much, Erik, for coming on the show. And for everyone, please follow along with Erik's work. He does really incredible work. You can find all of his contact, social handles and things like that in the show notes. So thanks again, Erik. And thank you all for listening. If you find value in this podcast, really encourage you to share this episode with anyone you might think would be interested in this show. And also to keep up with our show, we have our Substack that I've mentioned before in episodes. So if you sign up for our Substack, you'll get episodes delivered to your inbox every Tuesday. And we also do a weekly newsletter as well, focusing on world events and Bitcoin through the lens of progressive values and things like that. So be sure to sign up for our Substack if you haven't already, and be sure to check out our sponsors as well, and those promo links for SAS Mining and Bitbox in the show notes to take advantage of those. And if you have any feedback at all, as always, you can reach out to me at hello@progressivebitcoiner.com. All right, I'll let you get to the episode now, and we will see you again next week. Hey, Erik, welcome to the Progressive Bitcoiner. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Trey.
Absolutely. Really looking forward to this conversation. I think there's so much going on that I don't know where to start in terms of, you were just saying, getting back from some travels and jumping back into Bitcoin stuff. But I want to let you introduce yourself. I think some people will know who you are and know some of the products you've probably worked on. Maybe seen you on social media and stuff like that. But do you want to tell people, who you are, what you do?
Yeah, for sure. My name's Erik. I'm a UX designer. That stands for user experience designer. I work on a couple of different Bitcoin projects and some open source stuff. Some of the Bitcoin projects that I work on, one is Hoseki, which is a Bitcoin proof of assets or proof of reserves piece of software. It lets you basically prove that you have Bitcoin ownership without having to move it, largely using signature verification. So it uses kind of these innate properties that already exist in the Bitcoin protocol to let you express that ownership. Another project that I've been working on that's kind of more in the open source world is eNuts, which is a cashu wallet. So for those who don't know, cashu is a Chaumian and eCash based kind of scheme for Bitcoin that interoperates with Bitcoin Lightning. And what cashu does is it basically uses blinded signatures to allow people to send tokens, eCash tokens that are pegged to Lightning, and you can send these very privately and instantly with no fees. So it's kind of a very kind of timely and relevant project to be working on now.
Yeah. Tell people a little bit why you feel that it's timely and relevant to work on. Obviously, one of the things that I had mentioned to you is love to discuss, part of this show and part of what I think is super important is just talking to regular everyday folks who are just coming into Bitcoin, fortunately or unfortunately, especially if some crazy price action starts happening this year, more and more people get more intrigued and interested in Bitcoin. And hopefully, if they're using Bitcoin as it's intended, they're using products that lets them hold their own keys, spend and send Bitcoin, all of this stuff. And one thing they might notice the past little while, fees have been pretty expensive for Bitcoin on chain. And then figuring out how to use Lightning, how to use these other products, whether it's Liquid, cashu, things like that, to just be able to spend Bitcoin and not be so overwhelmed by the expensive fees or trying to time fees and things like that. So, can you talk to people a little bit about, maybe we can just start there with enuts or with cashew in general, and how that maybe addresses some of those concerns?
Yeah, so in the high fee environment that we've been seeing right now, it's making on chain kind of prohibitively expensive for very small transactions, especially if you want to onboard a new person.
Hmm.
So maybe taking like a step back is one thing that I like to think about as a designer is what is the experience of somebody that's trying to accomplish a goal. So if you look at like somebody that's brand new to Bitcoin and they're trying to interact with Bitcoin for the first time, there are different kind of routes they can go on. There are different ways, and usually what you want to have is create a good positive onboarding experience, meaning that when they use it, it kind of has a feeling of magic and it kind of feels like it works and like it's simple and it's intuitive. And in order to do that, there are different kind of shortcuts you can take, or there are, different layers of Bitcoin that they can use to accomplish this. So, and design plays a role in this as well. So enuts is like I mentioned, is a cashew wallet. And what enuts allows someone to do is to instantly receive ecash, which is denominated in sats. And it does this because you don't need to have one. You don't need to open up a Lightning channel to interact with Cashu. You can just open up a Cashu wallet, and then just somebody can push money directly to you. In enuts, in Cashu, the money is the data. So it eliminates that barrier to entry of having to, maybe if you download an on-chain wallet, the first thing you have to do is wait 10 minutes for transaction confirmation. If you download a non-custodial Lightning wallet and you receive money, you have to open up a channel first. So there's that kind of like issue of having like enough liquidity and inbound liquidity to receive the payment. Now, one of the things that you kind of touched on is in order to, there are different kind of philosophies about, what is Bitcoin, what is real Bitcoin, how do you make this distinction? And this is kind of where custodial and non-custodial kind of come into play. These are two different ways to use Bitcoin. And there are certain people that feel, if it's custodial Bitcoin, it's not real Bitcoin.
Hmm.
It's not your keys, not your Bitcoin. So I look at things a little bit differently. I think that there are different tools to accomplish different tasks.
Hmm.
And in an analogy that I like to use is when you're learning how to drive a car, the first thing you don't want to do is maybe parallel park or just go on the highway immediately or try something like that. The first thing you want to do is, practice in kind of like a nerfed environment and maybe a parking lot. You go slow, you learn the basics first before you get into the more advanced things.
Hmm.
And I think that the experience of using Bitcoin can be a lot like that. Maybe the first touch point that someone has with Bitcoin, it should be as simple as possible. It should have as little barriers as possible. It should have as little kind of potentials for the person to fail as possible. And this is where I think custodial solutions can play a role. And Cashu is a custodial solution. So there is a mint. There is a central server that is authorizing, in this case, is signing, burning, and issuing eCash tokens.
Hmm.
So it is a custodial solution. There's no no doubt about that. It's very clear, but it has a lot of benefits. Not only are there tremendous privacy benefits, but there are kind of the benefits where you can transact immediately without any fees.
Hmm. Yeah, uh, I'm glad you mentioned this. I've mentioned this a few times on the show because I think of my own journey in Bitcoin, and I don't have any technical background. I'm such like a humanities kid and history buff, and political nerd. So coming into all of this, any technical components of this, like yes, I know how to navigate like Google Suite and efficiencies for work and my nonprofit work, things like that. But coming in, I think I bought a Bitcoin on like Coinbase. Everything I was using was pretty centralized at first. But immediately, once I kind of started understanding, really in the first month of Bitcoin and what it was, I wanted to protect it and I wanted to figure out how do I hold this in the best, most secure way possible, just
Exactly.
understanding that. So I think some people need to realize and remember, maybe not everyone does that, but a large amount of people, once they get Bitcoin and once they start accumulating more, they want to figure out what's the best way for me to hold this and secure this or use this in the way it's like intended, right? Those kind of things. And I know there's many ways that it's meant intended to be used, but I mean in terms of like maybe holding your own keys, things like that. I think some folks get afraid that if once they start on a centralized, um, place or kind of something that's really easy of access, they'll just stay there. and get lazy with it.
Hmm.
And I'm like, well, maybe that's a conversation for the ETFs and things like that. But something like purchasing Bitcoin within the first month, I sent it to, I think, Moon Wallet at the time. And then I kind of went down that rabbit hole of running like Raspberry Pi. Like I was just like, oh my gosh, I need to like figure this out pretty quickly. And if I did that with zero technical background, I'm like, I think a good chunk of people are going to want to try to figure out how to use this. So I think the concern is a little overblown sometimes in the Bitcoin community. And I could be, you know, really wrong about this in some ways, but I've seen it just from personal examples that other people have mentioned that are similar to mine.
Yeah, I mean, there's the famous kind of Steve Jobs example. He used to say, they will learn when he discussed certain design ideas that maybe were kind of ahead of its time or whatever the case may be. I think that people are a lot smarter than
Mhm.
sometimes we Bitcoin, or they're more capable than we give them credit for, and people will learn how to use these things, and design and UX is going to play a role in that because we're progressively getting better and better at making these things less technically challenging. The more that Bitcoin matures, it's still only 15 years old. It's still kind of a very a very young
Mhm.
protocol. It's a very young technology, and it doesn't have a lot of. It's also very immature in terms of design. There hasn't been a lot of design culture and a lot of design focus in this protocol, and that's continuing to evolve the more time, just the older that this gets. So it's all going to lead to becoming a lot more easier, and
Yeah.
then people are also going to see the value in why you don't want to have your savings on a custodial solution. These things will become more understandable.
Right. I would say with like cashew and e-nuts, which I've played around with it for a few months. I absolutely love it. It's one of my favorite things I think to play with in terms of like an app and
Hmm.
sending and spending. I just think it's really cool. But also, enuts or anyone in cashew has been very upfront. I think just in terms of saying this is a custodial solution, like no one's trying to play any tricks on what it is or isn't type thing. But for you, is there some of the ways I like to think is in terms of metaphors, and I've heard so many different metaphors about cashew. Is there metaphors that you kind of refer to when explaining to people who, let's say, they barely know anything about Bitcoin, much less
Hmm.
cashew and kind of what's going on with enuts? Are there typical metaphors that you would say in terms of, because I think one of the greatest things about it is kind of the walled garden privacy
Yeah.
component of it is very, very cool as a solution, and I could see so many really great use cases in environments where that's really needed. Like it's nice to have like in a US or Western context, but there's so many other use cases I could think for, especially for human rights and things like this.
Hmm.
For surveillance states, China, all sorts of other things. So are there metaphors that you typically go to when explaining cashew?
Yeah, there's I like to use the metaphor of you're kind of at a casino and you're getting these poker chips.
Mm,
So let's say with Kashu, you come in with your money, which in this case is Bitcoin, and you want to be able to go to the just like you would in the casino. You go to the teller at the casino and you give them the money, and in exchange they give you these chips, right? They have no idea kind of who you are, but they can take your money. They can say, okay, this is authentic money, and they can issue you these chips that they know that they are authentic as well. So then you get these chips, and then you can go about the casino, and you can do all kinds of things with these chips, right? You can trade them with other people. They can exchange hands 5, 10, 15 times. You can swap them with other people. You can bet and then get a bunch of other chips that belong to other people and mix it up. And when you let's say that you want to then cash out, you want to exchange these poker chips for your Bitcoin or your money again. Well, then you would go to the teller and you would hand them back these chips. Now, the teller at this point, they have no idea who, if they look at your stack of chips, they have no idea how many people you transacted with, who were those people,
mm,
which accounts they belong to. The teller has absolutely no idea. All the teller does is it looks at the chips, it has a way of authenticating them, saying, okay, yeah, these aren't forgeries, these aren't inauthentic. And then it takes the chips, it cashes them out, and it gives you your money again. So this is how you can see that it kind of has that privacy benefit where the mint in this case is totally blind. It has no concept of users, of accounts, or anything like that. Its only knowledge is this token valid or not? Was it issued by me or not? And it does that through verifying its signature. So is this something that I've signed for in the past, or have I not signed for it? And then when the mint looks at it, it says, okay, this is valid. It burns it, destroys it, and then it redeems another one.
Mm.
So that's kind of how it keeps this chain of privacy going, and it prevents double spending as well.
Yeah, and I don't know if we've said it, but the on ramp and off ramp is Lightning. So this is through
Hmm.
that Lightning invoice process. If I'm not mistaken, there's no kind of on chain. It's only Lightning, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So you exchange Lightning, Bitcoin on Lightning for cashu or eCash tokens, and then you can just interact with these tokens with anyone as long as they're connected to the same mint, the same central server or bank as you would call it. And what's beautiful about cashu is that anyone can run their own mint. So
Mm.
we've set it up on LN Bits, where you can go to LN Bits and you can spin up your own cashu mint in a couple of clicks. And we're working on making that progressively more and more easier. So you can see how we can get to a world where if a lot of people are running their own mints, it kind of helps with sovereignty and preventing centralization in that
Yeah.
regard.
Do you think there? I don't know if this, because I know there's kind of mint management. I guess it's more just of a naming mechanism for the user. But I know in
Hmm.
eNuts, because I've been playing around a lot with Zeus Wallet and Lightning and the node in your phone. So is that kind of a similar thing that could happen with Cashew, where there's a mint management in the mobile device, such as like node in your phone, or would it not be similar to that?
Their degree. So we're working on having mint management that will allow you to basically connect to multiple mints, or what you can do also is, if you have certain tokens in that you've already issued with the mint, you can go into the various mint and check if those tokens have been spent or not. But there's
Right.
less of a degree of control over you have with like a node, for example. But we are, giving you the ability to connect to multiple different cashew mints. Any mint that's a part of the cashew protocol, you should be able to connect to from one app.
Got it. And what do you think, kind of looking to the future? Obviously, how long has Cashew been around? Has it been just a couple of years? Has it been longer than that in terms of protocol?
Yeah, I think it's been a little. It was about a year and when was Baltic Honey Badger in September? No,
I think
June,
I think it was
July.
because you sent me over that video. Yeah, yeah. It
Okay,
this past summer, late summer. Yeah.
yeah. So it was a year in the summer. So the
Okay.
developer that has largely been working on it, it's a team effort. But Kale BTC has been
Mm.
kind of one of the main developers for it. He got the idea a couple days after not last year's Honey Badger, but the Honey Badger before that.
Oh,
So he
cool.
started
Okay.
working on it then, and then the most recent Honey Badger was about exactly a year to the date. So I would say it's probably been like a year and some change, a year and a couple months. So it's very much like a very young protocol, and it's picked up a tremendous amount of steam since then.
Got it. And how do you? What are some of the use cases that you visualize, or the type of user? Obviously, anyone can use it, but the type of use case where it's like this is really good to consider using something like eNuts or just Cashew. And when I say eNuts, folks, that's the app. Like think of that. That's like the wallet in this
Hmm.
instance that utilizes Cashew. Um, so what are kind of the ideal use cases for Cashew? If someone's like, okay, let me play around with eNuts, but like what's the main difference there between using like a Lightning wallet I'm really comfortable with, or a custodial Lightning wallet, even
Yeah.
things like that.
So one of I think the biggest benefit that's absolutely immediately is privacy. So with any custodial wallet, in order for a custodial wallet to work, is that it has to have a concept of an account. It has
Mhm.
to have an idea of who you are as a user, uh, who you are transacting with, how much you are transacting with. It has to kind of see all that. So with cashu, with enuts, all that can be basically obliterated by introducing the concept of a mint. And for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, the mint has no insight into accounts, who you're transacting with, what your balance is. So if any custodial, the way I look at it is that any custodial wallet, any Lightning wallet that exists right now that is custodial, it can be exponentially improved in terms of privacy by implementing cashew
Mm.
on it. So that is like one kind of major area that I see that this can work immediately right away. That's probably like my biggest one. And the another one is in order to onboard people with zero fees.
Mm.
So if you want to get someone to experience Bitcoin kind of immediately, you can have them download Cashew, send it to them right away, and you won't have to worry about a channel opening in the case of Lightning, or in the case of non-custodial Lightning, I should say, or waiting 10 minutes for a confirmation in the case of on-chain and then paying on-chain fees.
Got it. And do you know, we didn't touch on this beforehand, but there's been a lot of conversations recently about Liquid as well. Like Liquid was around for a little while and then it wasn't. And then high fee environment, people are kind of looking to other solutions again. So we don't have to discuss it if you're like, that's not really, my area or focus, but I'm curious if, because some folks will say, okay, well, what's obviously there's difference between Liquid and cashew in something using something like enuts and using these mints. So for folks that would compare, because a lot of folks only know Bitcoin and Lightning, then they hear other things like Liquid and cashew. They might say, okay, well, I'm kind of using Liquid for that. Would you be able to speak on kind of differentiating between those things? Because there are some pretty large differences there.
Yeah, I'm always hesitant to speak on other projects, especially projects that I'm just not too kind of well versed on. With Liquid, my understanding is that it's not an exact L2, but it's more like a sidechain, and there's a federation
Hmm.
that is involved with pegging in and out, exchanging Liquid BTC to BTC. But I'm sorry, I can't speak too much about it just because it's kind of outside of my area of expertise. I've barely used it. I downloaded Aqua Wallet yesterday, and
Yeah, I did
I
too.
did a receive, and that's kind of the extent. But I haven't
Yeah.
looked a lot under the hood.
Yeah, I feel the same way, and I know BTC Sessions has been posting about it, which is helpful. So I'll continue just kind of looking into it. But I'm more comfortable with the understanding of cashew, Lightning, Bitcoin. That still feels like the
Hmm.
Bitcoin sphere to me. Once we get into Liquid, things feel a little bit shady is the wrong word, and I don't want to imply that there's like shady things going on with it, but it
Yeah.
it feels like an outside of Bitcoin project that's trying to engage with Bitcoin and connect there. And for a while, it didn't. I know there are a lot of people that I really respect that is like this. Liquid is not a solution. Again, that's my personal opinion. I also haven't
Hmm.
played with it too much, so I shouldn't speak too much on it. But are there folks that you've heard from or kind of seen that are like, oh, well, using cashew or I haven't seen this too much myself, but I can imagine some folks as they're listening are like, oh, that's a shit coin. You're just creating like, what are you talking about? Creating this coin or mint or someone maybe who's hearing for this for the
Hmm.
first time. How would you respond to people when they think about cashew within the Bitcoin ecosystem and how that works, and who might be like skeptical of what you're saying?
Yeah, I would say it's no more or no less of a shitcoin than any custodial wallet, Lightning custodial wallet to Lightning custodial wallet transaction.
Mm,
It's the same risk model is there, which is that the central server, the mint in this case, can rug. They can run off with your funds. But we have the privacy benefits. So if somebody feels like it's a shitcoin, what I hear most often is that it's not real Bitcoin,
yeah, yeah,
because
that's a better
you
way to
don't
say it. Yeah,
yeah, because you don't have your private keys, and I think that's true. It's a layer two custodial solution, and we're very clear about that. That's if you don't believe or you aren't interested in scaling Bitcoin in by using custodial solutions, then uh, enuts cashew is probably not going to be a solution that you're too excited for.
yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the one thing I'd say, I think there's so many use cases. Like the one I think of too is like integration with Nostr, right? Like Nostr, like
Yeah.
thinking about it, this kind of walled garden approach, and then exchanging these kind of like again going into the casino. And again, the casino analogy, I'm like, oh, great. People are thinking casino gambling,
Oh
but
God,
but it,
yeah, I didn't even
but
think
in
about
terms of
that.
like
Yeah.
entering in, sometimes I also have thought about it as in like an ATM, right? So when you're thinking of privacy perspective, like if you
Hmm.
withdraw cash from a Bank of America here in the U.S. ATM, the bank can see, okay, you withdrew this amount from your, whatever. Let's say someone's actually managed to, and it's even more difficult in this case because you're talking about Lightning invoice, so that's kind of a bit harder to track. But let's say somehow they identify, okay, you create a Lightning invoice and you've engaged with X amount of Sats into the mint, into cashew, enuts, that kind of thing. Just like withdrawing cash from an ATM, you go and spend the cash. The bank doesn't know what you're spending cash on.
Hmm.
Maybe if there's different seals and serial numbers on the cash bills, but let's say, hypothetically, they don't know. And then you deposit whatever cash back into, and okay, then they can engage again, hypothetically. But with Lightning, that's even more difficult. So if it's already really difficult with cash, it's like imagining the privacy benefits of also going from on-chain to Lightning. Okay, that's already a privacy enhancement, and then going into Cashew. The privacy is just astounding, and that's one of the biggest problems facing Bitcoin I see is privacy. That's why people have played around with Monero before. That's why so many
Hmm.
other projects had been really up and running the past few years because they're like, oh, Bitcoin's terrible for privacy without certain tools, right? Just the protocol in general is meant to be on chain public ledger, and there's so many reasons for that. But on the point of privacy, both of us coming from the left, and I'm not sure about in your context, but this is, I think, governments in general, but especially in the U.S. Obviously, we've heard a lot with Elizabeth Warren and Bitcoin and privacy and funding terrorism and this and that. But there's a general trend that many people, many Bitcoiners are really worried about just this erosion of privacy over many years, integrated into law, that kind of thing. So in terms of privacy for money, exchanging value, Bitcoin, cashew, how do you view these things and the importance of privacy while also discussing to like a mainstream audience the importance of privacy? Not like a privacy, in my bunker waiting for the end times, right? Because I think that's what people too often associate with like, why do you need to be private so much? Why do you want to be anonymous? Why
Hmm.
do you want to, and people don't really understand the Cypherpunk Manifesto and privacy and, your ability to reveal to the world what you would like privacy is not secrecy. How do you talk to people, whether it's just like normal everyday people about
Yeah.
privacy or thinking about, because I'm trying to figure out what I'm trying to say, rambling here is, connecting privacy to like the mainstream world and letting them know why it's so important and why it's not this like secret cultish thing that we're on about.
Yeah, this is kind of especially something that kind of comes up in my day to day because I live in Sweden, and in
Mm.
Sweden, it's a fairly democratic society. It has functioning judicial institutions, and but also there's kind of a lack of privacy in Sweden where they have a law where you can just Google someone's name and you can see their address, you can pull their tax
Yeah,
return. So it's a very transparent and open society, and they kind of
that's
have
right.
this idea where you should be able to do that in order to basically discourage corruption, right? You should be transparent and open.
Mm.
So when I talk about transparency with money in this kind of society, I get a side eye. I get a look as to why, and
Mhm.
I often think about okay, so what is their perception? So these are individuals who grew up in a very high trust society. They live, like I said, in a country with a very functioning legal system
Mhm.
where they have property rights and privacy rights, and for the most part, these things work for them. So they might have a certain understanding of, hey, why do you need that? But what I try to tell them is, in most of the rest of the world, this isn't the case, right? People don't have the luxuries of having a robust system that defends their liberties and their privacy like we do in Sweden. So it's kind of a different perception, and I think that one piece that was helpful, at least in the United States, was the Snowden revelation. So like a lot
Mhm.
of people, they use that to understand, okay, this is the power that you know, this is the level of data that you can uncover just by someone's metadata, right? Just by understanding, what cell towers they connected to, and things like that. Not even eavesdropping on their conversation, but just like the metadata that they leave when they interact with the web can build, a very robust picture of who they are. And a
Mhm.
lot of people saw that and then they understood, wow, like that, that's an issue because there are people just getting swept up on this. So I think of privacy as not, when I try to communicate to them about like why privacy is valuable, my biggest example is I kind of give them examples about most of the rest of the world. Like if you meet an activist in Bahrain, for example, they might have their bank account frozen and they need the ability to transact privately.
Mhm.
So they'll kind of understand that example in that context. I think when you just explain to people that there's a larger world out there that doesn't operate under the same conditions that our countries operate, so, you can imagine why privacy might be important in their cases. And that's kind of usually, I find that message is usually a lot more well received, rather than trying to argue why they need it. Because in
Mhm.
reality, they might not need it. They might not need
Yeah.
private money
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
private transactions. PayPal and Venmo or whatever, that probably works just fine for them. And
Mhm.
that's great. But for a lot of other people, they do need it. And those aren't options.
Yeah. Yeah, that's been my approach to, there's from my, perspective in my circles, like there's kind of the left liberal things that I see on social media in terms of some of these things, or gosh, even like Facebook neighborhood groups are such a thing in my community, just with different things. One thing recently that happened was really funny. I won't give like too many specifics, but um, one of the Facebook's groups I was a part of decided to remove anonymous posting because they were like, if someone's posting anonymously, they have bad intentions, right? And obviously,
Hmm.
like I've been in the Bitcoin circle long enough that that's very normal to me now. But I'm reminded, oh yeah, like even someone being anonymous is like, for some people, they're like, what are they up to? That's kind of the first,
Yeah, yeah.
right? And it only take, but when I talk with those same people in real life about what you just said, they're like, oh, okay. Like, so it's such like an echo chamber of like, the classic left liberal approach on some things online, but then talking to that person in person about, okay, you might not need this, but this is why this group of people or this person might need it. In general, that's usually my go-to is that human
Hmm.
rights angle, and then talking with them about, okay, we might not need it, but they really do, and they're like, oh, I had no idea, because it's not the main narrative around any of these things, and I think that's super important to discuss.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, speaking of, so one of the things I'm curious about too, because I've connected with some, Bitcoiners kind of in your neck of the woods in Europe and Sweden, and I'm always very interested in terms of just the cultural aspect of where Bitcoin is. And it's been a little bit since I've connected with someone on like the cultural temperature check of Bitcoin or these type of things in Sweden. So how do you find that amongst your, whether it's circle of friends, whether it's people in Sweden in general? Of obviously we're so entrenched in just like U.S. politics here and politicization of everything. And I understand this happens a lot throughout Western Europe as well with Bitcoin. I've heard numerous stories of Germany. Things play out sometimes similarly with Bitcoin, especially environmentally. But what's the temperature right now on Bitcoin in your neck of the woods?
I would say by default, it's usually treated with skepticism, and usually a little bit of hostility. And
Mm,
at least in Sweden, the biggest kind of point is the environmental point.
mhm,
There's been a lot of, maybe that's in Sweden more than other countries. Sweden really prides itself in being very environmentally forward, environmentally conscious,
mhm,
and they see themselves as a country that takes great pride in their efforts to help the environment in various ways. So that FUD, that kind of attack vector, is very sticky here in Sweden. Is definitely the environmental one.
This episode of The Progressive Bitcoiner is brought to you by Zeus. Zeus is a self custodial Bitcoin wallet for Android and iOS. The app features a built in Lightning node that allows you to take full control of how you make payments on chain and on Lightning. You can easily onboard to the Lightning network and let Zeus's Lightning service provider, Olympus, do all the heavy lifting for you. Or you can get more hands on and curate your own Lightning channels with whoever you transact with most. Zeus has best in class privacy and allows you to have great peace of mind when sending and receiving Lightning payments. Not only does the Zeus team not want to know how you're using your money, but they're building things in a way that they can't know. There's also a first of its kind Lightning address that will allow you to receive payments 24/7 to your mobile wallet self-custodially. This is a great solution for a range of people. For those who just want to have the technical ability to set up their own infrastructure, to nomads and dissidents that need to accept donations on the move. Other Lightning wallets don't give the users this level of control. In fact, many of them operate more like bank accounts that can be revoked and ultimately lead to you losing your money. With Zeus, you're in full control of your private keys and therefore can start to take full control of your financial destiny. To learn more and to learn where to download, head to ZeusLN.com. Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, that's the same here. Like I was literally just talking with a coworker in the nonprofit I work at. And, I'm in Boston area, Massachusetts, very liberal, very climate forward. Always engaged with circles from the left. That's why when so many Bitcoiners say something, I'm like, okay, but I know how that's going to be perceived or read or interpreted.
Hmm.
Um, but the two things they mentioned that came up over Christmas was literally the criminals line and the environment. So I think those two are still the main sticking points. Which is good in my mind in that there aren't others that are coming up, at least not yet. Um, but the environment one is getting harder and harder to support and impact. I don't even know if it's Sweden or Norway. Maybe this doesn't help the cause, but I understand there's some more Bitcoin mining operations that are popping up in some of these like energy rich nations, especially with renewable. So again, I don't know whether that will, maybe it'll hurt in the short term, but help in the long term if people start, hearing about, Bitcoin mining operations expanding to their neck of the woods and things like that. But I'm hoping over time that FUD kind of is slipping away in the general public because more people that are not Bitcoiners are talking about it in different ways, different journalists, in
Yeah,
different
it
publications.
feels like it.
Yeah, yeah, which is very exciting. And I know there's been Bitcoiners. I mean, Daniel Batten's been huge in this,
Hmm.
pushing those different narrative changes, for sure, which has been really helpful. One thing I wanted to ask too before I always forget to do this with some newer guests as well, before we get too much further into the conversation, is your own journey with Bitcoin. Like for you, I want to hear a little bit more. I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about, your own journey into Bitcoin. Were you always kind of looking into these type of things, like cypherpunk things, where especially kind of coinciding with your design background, how
Hmm.
did those two things happen together for you?
Well, I've always been kind of a child of the internet. I very
Mm,
much grew up online. I was, posting on forums when I was 12, 13, and whatever the case may be. So I heard about Bitcoin. This was probably like a little bit after I graduated high school. And I kind of just dismissed it, or I didn't even think about it, right? It's just the thing that
yeah.
you read about and then you just kind of moved on about your day. It just was like, okay, whatever. I did have my first touch point with Bitcoin was through a friend of mine who they wanted to buy 2CI, which was like kind of like a research chemical
Hmm.
on on the dark net. And I don't even know if it was Silk Road or what the site was,
Yep.
but he had been doing all the research and he bought like a netbook, which was like, I don't know if you remember those, like a small little laptops that you could buy
Yes.
like at Best Buy for like a couple $100 back then, and they were like super tiny and not very powerful. But he bought that just to surf like the dark web,
Oh, that's so
and
funny.
yeah, and he wanted to buy like 2CI, and he started talking to me about it. He's like, yeah, so I found this site. He's like, but they have to take Bitcoin. He goes, and I've been doing research. He's like, and I found this way that we can get it. We have to mail a money order to some guy that he
Oh yeah.
found online. So like we went to 7-Eleven, we got a money order and we just mailed it off. And then I
Just
think he
wait.
was using, yeah, it was just like, how do we know that this guy's legit? He's like, no, don't worry. He's like, dude, I've done research on him on the forums. I've read his reviews. This guy's legit. He'll send it. And then, you're just waiting. And I think he was using, with hindsight, I think it might have been like Electrum. I don't know. It was like some very
Hmm.
like gray wallet back, like literally like gray gooey wallet back then. But eventually it worked. The Bitcoin came through.
Yeah.
And that was like my first interaction with it. It took days, but I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like,
Hmm.
you mailed off this money order, and then you have like, this other money on this wallet, and then you're able to send it through this website, and then then a couple weeks later, whatever the case may be, the 2CI appeared, which is like this little research chemical in this little pills. And that was like my first kind of like touch point with Bitcoin, but I didn't appreciate it at all. I
Hmm.
didn't think about like, how does that work? Why is that valuable? Like, how is it that this money could be used kind of for this purpose? What properties does this technology have that these people would want it, or why would they want to use it? None of that even crossed my mind at all.
Hmm.
And for years, I didn't think about it again. It was
Yeah.
just kind of a silly little thing that we did, and it wasn't until much later. I think it might have been a little bit after Trump got elected,
Hmm.
that I read. I don't even remember where I read this, but I read this article about like Venezuelan Bitcoin miners. I think that their miners got seized, but
Hmm.
the individuals that were running the mining operation, they were able to flee or leave the country with the Bitcoin. And I remember coming back. So I was like, oh yeah, I remember Bitcoin. I had that one experience with it years ago. And I was like, how is that still a thing? And I was thinking like, I was like, what do you mean they took the miners, but they were able to keep the Bitcoin? I had no understanding of how this worked. And at this time, maybe I was a little bit older, and I was thinking like, well, how does that work? That sounds really fascinating and interesting to
Hmm.
me. How can like a government come take your miners, your computers, and you still have the money? In my mind, the money just existed on the miners. I knew nothing. And then I started reading about it a little bit more, and and from there, this was probably around 2017, 2018. From there was like already a lot of content out online, and
Yeah.
a lot of resources. So it really just kind of sent me down the rabbit hole. And then I started reading about, like the cypherpunk mailing list, and David Chaum and Timothy May and all
Hmm.
this stuff. And I had already kind of left leaning kind of, uh, you know, political views because I was very sympathetic to Occupy Wall Street and kind of things like that. And I realized that all this kind of intersects. It's very similar. Like this is Bitcoin is an opt out. It's a protest against the status quo. It's a protest against the system of money, right? Of fiat money that is used, to manipulate and control. And I was like, this is really incredible. So that's kind of how I just got further and further down along. And as a designer, I've always been designing websites, and I got into UX. It just seemed like the natural evolution from designing websites. You go into UX design, and then I just realized that wow, like the experience of using Bitcoin seems like it's really, really kind of not great. It's not intuitive. I struggle. I trip. I fumble all the time when trying to do things, and that led me to think, hey, I'm someone that can help. Like I spent a lot of time, designing interfaces for other things, not necessarily Bitcoin related, but I know that I can help here. So I just started getting involved on GitHub, looking at some projects that I thought were cool, some node management projects, some wallets, and just started, giving insight on issues, opening issues, giving design suggestions, and kind of led me to where I am now.
That's awesome. Did you have any I mean, it doesn't matter as much anymore, especially, but like formal training? Did you, go to school for different design stuff, or was this a lot of like self-taught playing around with stuff?
Yeah, I did go to school for design, but it wasn't very useful for kind of the day-to-day stuff that I use now
Mm,
because it was more of a visual design program.
got it.
And most of what I learned when it comes to kind of UX design, user interface design, and user experience design, most of that came from online, from YouTube, from reading books. A lot of it came from following tutorials. And when it came to designing for Bitcoin, well, there's no guide for that. Really, you just have to. It's the Wild West. You just have to download these apps, get wrecked, lose things, become frustrated by why these things aren't working, and then realize like, yeah, we can make these things better. And part of what I was doing at the time was I was looking at other chains like Ethereum and stuff, and I was just not because I was interested in their technology, but just because I wanted to see their UX. And I realized that wow, these guys are a bit ahead in terms of design and user experience. Some of these like Web3 and like Ethereum type projects, like they seem to have culturally placed more of an emphasis on design, and using their wallets in their products is much more pleasant. And that kind of really lit a fire under me. I was like, yo, we need to step it up on Bitcoin. Like
Mhm.
we can't like fall behind in terms of design and usability.
Yeah, I completely agree, and it's funny. It's a little bit different, but when I was talking with Laura and Ricky recently from the Bitcoin Explorers, they were talking about in their travels, they've seen like crypto everywhere around the world. It's just even crypto advertising and marketing, and just the way they engage with people, like culturally, trying to stay culturally relevant. Bitcoin is starting to get a little bit better with that, I think. I think, especially I think Cash App and things like that getting a little bit more. And again, this is a separate conversation from like the actual products and things like that, but more just like trying to engage culturally with people, trying to engage with like use cases, like BitKey, like a hardware wallet recently coming out from
Yeah, love
from
it.
Cash App. Um, did you actually get it? Or I think I saw a post recently that you were like, I don't know if I'm going to order it because it seemed like it was such a headache to try to get it there in terms of cost.
No, yeah,
Yeah,
the,
yeah.
the shipping to Europe, I forgot it was like $80 or something. I
Yeah.
was like,
Oh
oh
my
yeah, no,
gosh. Yeah. Come on, Jack. Just send him one.
yeah,
Um, but anyway, just there's some other products and Lightning wallets and things like this that, and obviously I think eNuts is like beautiful. Like I love when an app just is like simple and works. And I mean, even on the surface, eNuts is like this is beta software. Like everything's
hmm
clear about what it is. So things are getting better there. But again, I think it's because most of the people that up to this date have been working on Bitcoin are really fundamentally like cypherpunk encoders, like
yeah,
historically throughout the movement. So that is their focus about like, you know, code and purity, and that's been the approach. Whereas, I think too, I'm curious your thoughts on this if you have any perspective. I think just in terms of funding as well, and those kind of icky subjects that Bitcoiners, well, especially folks on the left, don't like to talk about money in general. So that's kind of a hard,
mm.
overlap for people in general talking about money and wealth. But Bitcoin developers in general, like fundraising, like crypto projects, have been killing it with fundraising and capital and Web3 and all of these different names and things they spin up, especially during bull markets, to get massive amounts of money and funding from folks. Whereas Bitcoin projects have struggled with that. Some people have found Bitcoin to be boring, so we're going to move on to this project and this, and oh, this one's faster. This one does this one does that, and sure enough, 95% of them fail. But what are your perspective on the path forward for Bitcoin developers, designers, things like that, in this type of environment?
Yeah, I think I touched on it earlier when I said that Bitcoin's still like a very, very young
Hmm.
piece of technology, so it doesn't have a lot of like design literacy. But I think another part of it is also something that you hinted at, that it's a engineering first culture.
Hmm.
Bitcoin is very much a culture or a project where the idea is to build something that works, that is secure, and that has gone through very, very intensive levels of scrutiny. It's almost like NASA's engineering process. You spend 9,000 hours to whatever the number is, to make sure that this piece of code works from an engineering point of view, and that is the focus. And there's less of a focus on what does that translate, or what does that mean for the person that's actually using it. That's often an afterthought. It's often,
Hmm.
does it work? Is it bug free? Is it sound code? And when you have this kind of just engineering kind of mindset, the user experience kind of becomes secondary, or
Hmm.
sometimes it just becomes thrown in after the fact. And I think a part of what I try to do in all of the design work is I try to kind of meet people, everyday users, kind of where they're at, and in terms of what is their current experience of sending money. Whether it be through PayPal, through Venmo, through their own bank, through Zelle. Like, what is that experience like? What are they already familiar with? And how can we take some of those existing conventions and try to make the experience of transacting with Bitcoin similar to that, in terms
Hmm.
of following the conventions, in terms of following the flow, because they shouldn't have to learn an entirely new language or an entirely new way to interact with money or with their phone in order to use Bitcoin. And I'm very kind of a huge proponent of that, is that we need to eliminate this technical barrier to entry, eliminate the jargon, eliminate all these different things that are in the way, that make Bitcoin as easy to use as PayPal or as Venmo.
Hmm.
The experience should be similar. When you send it, it works. You don't have to understand the technicalities of how it works under the hood. You can, of course, if you want to, but you shouldn't have to in order to use it.
Yeah.
And it should be also something I try to do, is like, it should feel like a little bit magical. I really try to, when I design something, make it so that it has a little bit of a feeling that gets someone excited,
Hmm.
like when they first interact with it or when they first use it. If you've ever unboxed something, or if you ever use an app for the first time, it had a little bit of something special that kind of made you put your head back and smile and go, oh, that's cool.
Hmm.
Like those little micro interactions to me are what really kind of go a long way. And that's something I kind of emphasize in my design practice.
Yeah, it should be and can be fun, like building that into it. I think that's one thing with different Bitcoin products that I like to see, or even Noster
Hmm.
products, and just different things that are understanding it's so new, so building in this kind of fun element to that, right? And one day it might, and hopefully will, just be boring old money. I have that conversation a lot with people, that
Yeah.
one day that's just how it will be considered. But initially, getting people excited about that, and I constantly go back and forth. And doing this show is really interesting because I think in general, there's so many different types of things we like to talk about, and different topics that can be talked about Bitcoin and beyond, and especially the types of things we like to talk about. But sometimes I'll kind of be thinking out loud on the show, or thinking probably a couple months later, I might be like, I feel differently on that. And that's okay. Like, people can go back, and
Hmm.
if people say you said this, then I'm like, okay, I'll correct it. I'm not trying to, promote like scams or anything like that, but just in terms of viewpoints. And constantly I go back and forth. Like, sometimes I'm in the mode of like, Bitcoin and Bitcoin products need to be as easy to use as like Venmo, or else just like, it's not worth it. Then other times I'll take a step back and I'm like, well, for it to be self-sovereign and people to hold their own keys, and that there is a bit more hardware. So I think that's most important, for people to feel that they securely own their Bitcoin. And if the product is a little bit slower because of that, so be it. And obviously, I think there's probably a happy medium that we need to
Yeah.
get to. But how do you think about those? Do you view it as like a trade-off? Do you view it as, okay, we need to lean more towards ease of use for all of these products? Because I really have a tough time with that sometimes, and I constantly go back and forth when
Yeah.
playing around with products myself as like a non-technical person that's gotten a tiny bit more technical. But I constantly go back and forth when thinking about, I think even, the potential upcoming bull run and things like that. It's like, okay, what type of product should we focus on, or are the things that should be really important to newbies, and conveying that? Is it so important to convey all of the principles of what's going on under the hood or what Bitcoin is? Or is it more important to convey ease of use, get them excited, and then they'll learn later on?
I think it's important to have a wide variety of tools that have made different sets of trade offs. And Bitcoin designing and building for Bitcoin, I think, is probably the biggest game of trade offs imaginable.
Mhm.
It's just like the nature of the protocol. So almost every decision that you can make that will impact the experience or the functionality of whatever tool you're building will involve some type of trade off. If you want to have speed, you might have to sacrifice some decentralization. If you
Mhm.
want to have your privacy, you might have to sacrifice. If you want to have security, you might have to sacrifice a little bit of this. Or so it's almost always this game of trade offs. And I think that different wallets can make different sets of trade offs and then build a tool that will appeal to a certain user. In my mind, I believe ultimately the experience that users are going to want is going to be one where they don't have to think about the tool that they're using and it just works.
Mhm.
So, what sets of trade offs do we need to need to be made in order to optimize for a tool like that? It's a very complicated question. It probably depends on where we're at in terms of design, in terms of the protocol, in terms of any updates. Is CTV going to be here? So there's a lot of stuff that kind of plays into that equation. But ultimately, I think that as long as we live in a world where designers are thinking about different tools and different trade-offs and they're building with that in mind, we're going to be in a much stronger place for mass adoption.
Yeah. And I've definitely seen that more just well, I mean, being inside, Bitcoin, Twitter, and all this stuff, which is very small, a very microcosm, as we were talking about.
Hmm.
But one thing I think that has excited me more, I've seen less and less. I mean, companies will still say, okay, we're creating the best Bitcoin wallet for users. We're creating the best Lightning wallet, whatever. But in general, I've seen more and more wallets and developers and things being developed on Bitcoin. And then more of these developers are folks saying, okay, for this is the best for this use case, or this is the best for me because I prioritize XYZ. So taking that approach, I think, is really valuable, where it's like letting people choose. Everyone has different use cases. Some people are just going to hold Bitcoin and just it is their savings account. They don't really spend because, well, in the US, it's really hard to spend Bitcoin, right? You're supposed to
Yeah.
tax every transaction. It's very difficult and frustrating to do that. Other places don't have that jurisdictional, taxation and things like that. So people are regularly spending, and things like that. Other people are came into Bitcoin through Nostr, and they're using like Albi Wallet, like connected to their browser, and they just that's the only way they spend Bitcoin. So focusing on what is the user needing, and how are they going to use it, rather than we're going to make an all encompassing thing that there's no trade-offs, or it's universally fit. Well, Bitcoin is it's universally accessible, but there's so many different use cases with it. It's not as
Hmm.
simple as this is the Bitcoin wallet. And I think that's the way development needs to go, which is really exciting.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. Is that we have to keep in mind that the way that we use Bitcoin, based on your region, where you are in the world, is going to be very, very different than the way that other people use it and the things that they find valuable.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I'm wondering, we had touched on this just before recording. You said you've been in Bitcoin from like 2017, 2018 or so, probably jumping down the rabbit hole a little bit more. I like to touch on this with folks that have been in Bitcoin prior to 2019, 2020. For you, one of the things I know you and I both like to think about is just kind of culturally where Bitcoin is at, kind of getting out the message that, Bitcoin needs to be separate from folks' individual political views, religious
Hmm.
review, diets, whatever. Not that folks can't believe that, but that is not what Bitcoin is about. Like Bitcoin is this neutral technology accessible for everyone. For you being in Bitcoin since then through now, how do you feel? Where do you feel like the culture is at now? I've talked with many people that have suggested. Of course, I think a lot of the Bitcoin core developers early on were a bit more libertarian bent as well, depending on where they're coming from. But I think it got much more political right around COVID, as most of the world did, I think, in a
Yeah.
lot of ways. Now it might be coming back down a little bit. Some of the people that I think were here just for clickbait, they're still around, but many of them have just left that I've experienced. Shows people's true colors, I think. But where do you feel kind of culturally Bitcoin is at? And, do you have hope moving forward that it's building to more of it's not such a barrier anymore? Or where do you still see that being a barrier for people?
Yeah, I think with kind of the COVID wave and the COVID class and just that kind of temperature, as the tent of Bitcoin, or as the amount of people that were using it or interested in it or started adopting it, as that grew, you see an influx of people with different political ideologies also come. And I think this happens across not just Bitcoin but across a lot of other movements or
Hmm.
other political movements. As the movement gets bigger, different people come with their own perceptions, their own worldview, and they sometimes try to inject their worldview or their ideology into the movement or into the tool, Bitcoin in this case. And I think that's kind of what we saw with in the last couple of years. There's kind of been this, at least on Bitcoin Twitter, which is just one very very small subsect
Hmm.
of Bitcoin users, of where they're located and where they communicate. People with a very certain overlapping ideology tended to coalesce on that platform. And they had a lot of very similar opinions and ideologies that had absolutely nothing at all to do with Bitcoin, but that were being shared constantly in parallel with Bitcoin.
Hmm.
Things like, oh, you should, be a carnivore, or it's absolutely important for you to homeschool your kids and avoid the vaccine, and all this stuff that has absolutely just nothing to do with Bitcoin at all. And I don't think that is particularly helpful to making Bitcoin the most useful. And the reason I say that is because I think Bitcoin is most useful if more people use it. The more
Hmm.
people that use and adopt Bitcoin, the more useful as a tool that it is for everyone. And when you inject, a personal ideology onto the tool, onto the protocol, what that serves is to alienate a bunch of other people who don't share that ideology. So I find it incredibly just totally unuseful. And I'm not to say that those people can't have their conversations or they all can't agree on their ideologies, but to try to intertwine that with Bitcoin is just very, very misguided to me.
Hmm.
To say that Bitcoin is a libertarian Austrian economic project,
Hmm.
that's just insanity. Bitcoin is just money. It's an alternative to fiat money that works, right? It's a neutral form of money. And I think that going forward is that we're going to see that as kind of more people come, as this tent gets bigger, we're going to see even more kind of different ideologies come in. And eventually we'll start just seeing neutral ideologies, or people that are just, I hope that we get to the point where Bitcoin is just recognized as a tool, just as another form of money that
Hmm.
doesn't have any type of, you don't have to have a political bent, or it doesn't mean that people that use it have this type of political viewpoint or slant
Yeah.
that can be associated, that somebody could misinterpret or by going on searching the hashtag Bitcoin on Twitter, for example.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the episode. Today's episode is brought to you by Bitbox. Now, Bitbox is a hardware wallet that's open source, incredibly secure and easy to use, and it's what I'm using to safely secure my Bitcoin in cold storage. Now, I know self-custodying Bitcoin can really be intimidating, but Bitbox is designed for ease of use without compromising on security. It's USB-C compatible and allows you to easily back up and restore your private keys with a micro SD card, which is really cool. Now, you can purchase the Bitbox using the promo code TPB at the link found in the show notes for 5% off your purchase. And I really want to thank Bitbox for their support of the podcast, and I'm really excited about this new partnership. All right, I'll let you get back to the episode now. Yeah, and I hope it's like the internet, in the sense of like, okay, nowadays people don't think of the internet as like being used by a certain political group, maybe certain websites or certain
Hmm.
different things, right? Different aspects of that, but that would be the goal. And as you were saying, like inject their viewpoint, I just kept imagining like someone literally injecting that into like each block. Like I had like this visual of that, which I hadn't had before, which is really funny. And I was like, oh, that's funny to think about. Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important. And yeah, it because when I first started being more vocal in the Bitcoin space, and figuring out I wanted to contribute more and just started writing more and connecting with people. One of the first things I got early on, it's been less and less as I think people have seen, okay, we want Bitcoin to succeed. So we need all these different voices, was like, oh, you're trying to make Bitcoin political, right? And obviously the name of this podcast, some of it is a bit of like marketing because of the FUD and the left approach. Like, okay, progressive Bitcoiner, how is that going to work out? But eventually, hopefully, we won't really even need the name anymore, right? Like the two, it's not even a concept of okay, yeah, you can be from the left or whatever, and in
Hmm.
Bitcoin. And I still feel conflicted about it to this day because of so many things. But early on, people were like, "You're making Bitcoin political by saying progressive Bitcoin and this and that." And it's like, well, it's because there's such a loud, overwhelming majority of the content on Bitcoin is right leaning libertarian in the U.S. Whether it's podcasts,
Yeah.
writing, Twitter, things like that. That's been growing less and less, which is really good in general. Not because those people shouldn't have those platforms if they wanted in an audience, but because people will start not associating Bitcoin so much, just like you said, with a certain political ideology. And I think that's the goal. So I always get a kick when they're like, "You're making it political." I'm like, well, I'm only infusing that because it's been so overwhelmingly one political group so loud that for better or for worse, because I tell people I'm engaging with the real world, for better or for worse, I've had so many people say, "Oh, it's just for crypto bros," or "Oh, Ted Cruz," or these politicians,
Yeah.
these right wing politicians, like Bitcoin, or "Oh my gosh, it's just for like carnivores," or whatever. Like if someone can just see something about Bitcoin for an instance and be turned off for a year, 2 years, until they come back around, they're like, "Oh, it's still around." Kind of like the
Yeah.
thing that you had. Like people will come back around. I think whether it's a part of life or because they're interested, but we can't dismiss that some people are just turned off, that they should learn about it, and not say, okay, if someone you may not like will use Bitcoin for sure. That's not the point, but a lot of people get turned off by that. Is that something that you think a lot about in terms of the Bitcoin ecosystem? I was able to push through, but I think it's because I come from that background. Like a lot of my family is kind of conservative, right leaning, so I was able to like understand and push through some of that and see why people were thinking that way. But it's still a concern of mine to this day when talking about Bitcoin.
Yeah. I mean, it is somewhat of a concern of mine. I try not to like get super, or I don't immediately let a lot of my close friends know that I'm involved with Bitcoin, partly because, or not close friends, but like people that I meet
Yeah, yeah.
kind of immediately, because I fear that there is that connotation that, oh, you're involved with Bitcoin, that's like for those like anti-government, like
Hmm.
super privacy, like conspiracy theory, like internet types. And a part of it is also like I don't want that stigma, and I think like shows like this is doing a good job to show that, hey, there's a different side of Bitcoin.
Hmm.
There are other people that use it that aren't that don't only hold those political opinions. And for a while, like on Twitter, there was a point a couple years ago where like if there was like someone that's like left wing or progressive on like a popular Bitcoin podcast, they would get just like hounded in the comments, like,
Yeah, yeah.
"Oh, this person's a Marxist. How dare you have a communist on your show?" And just like I'm just like, if my like everyday friends just logged on and they just see this, like they're going to be so turned off by this movement, this technology, this community, they're not going to want to associate with it. So the way I navigated it was just I just didn't care. I mean, I
Hmm.
have my own views, and I don't I understand why there are a lot of people with those kind of views in Bitcoin. I understand why they can kind of see how it maps with their ideology, and I have no problem with it. But it just struck me as like it's not something that was going to change like my views or my political compass. I've always believed in the things that I believed in, and that's not to say that I dogmatically believe them and I won't change them at all
Hmm.
without if evidence is put in front of me or if things change. But I'm pretty strong in my convictions in the world that I live in and the things that I value, and Bitcoin hasn't changed that for me. It hasn't radically changed my point of view on these things. If anything, it strengthened them. It's shown
Hmm.
me that, hey, like this tool can be used to further those things that I believe in.
Yeah, yeah. I feel the same way. Is there anything that you You said it strengthened a lot of views. Was there anything that happened once you were kind of learning more about Bitcoin? And for me, just learning about like money and learning about,
Hmm.
some of the practices in the US with, money printing, debt obligations, things like that, that I get very frustrated with my quote unquote political party on the left that, I mean, both political parties aren't really concerned with debt, depending on who's in the White House in the U.S. Right? It's like if it's their person, okay, they're not gonna care that much, and they're like, okay, it's fine. But when it's the other candidate, they're like, the debt, so everyone's like
Yeah,
hypocritical with it.
exactly.
But just understanding some of these things, okay, at some point these things do really matter. How much do I want to speak out against that and things like that. But was there anything once you're learning more about Bitcoin that made you maybe question some of those assumptions more or view things a little differently?
Yeah, I think probably one of the big ones was the concept of free speech. I think I previously
Mm,
had here in Europe, it's compared to America, there are maybe more restrictions on that. Like
yeah.
just some examples, in Denmark or Sweden, I don't remember exactly which one. I think it was Sweden. There was a gentleman that was going around burning a Quran, and
Hmm.
in order for him to do this, he would have to file. He would have to get basically permission to do this as a public act. And the government was kind of like, "Hey, we don't really want to infringe free speech, so we're going to let him do it." But then he kept doing it, and it kept kind of escalating. And then eventually, they started denying his ability to do that. So a part of me, maybe in the past, would have sided with the state. Think, okay, it's okay to deny, someone a permit to do something that is purposely inflammatory and disrespectful and is trying to, just stoke tension and hatred and whatever the case may be. But I think the more that I've been involved with Bitcoin and the more that I've seen how the reality of people in other countries, I've come to realize that the free speech matters, and it's important for this to be as unrestricted as possible. And for example, like in Germany, something that's very well known is that they have like Holocaust denial laws. You can't publicly deny it, and there's been kind of an issue where they started associating pro-Palestinian chants and pro-Palestinian protests in Germany as anti-Semitic, and they've basically banned certain chants or certain types of speech, um, kind of in that movement.
Hmm.
And that's really kind of forced me to look at like, hey, a couple years ago, I probably would have sided with the state that it's okay to restrict speech. But now that I'm kind of seeing the consequences, it's like, it's freedom of speech for everyone or it's freedom of speech for nobody. And I would, say I flipped and I disagree that, the certain speech should be limited. I think that it's important that one of the hallmarks of like classic liberalism is that we are tolerant of people that want to speak regardless of how abhorrent we find their views.
Hmm.
And um being involved in Bitcoin and seeing the importance of that, I would say that it's kind of changed my opinion. I'm hesitant to say it's pushed me to the right because I don't see that as a right wing position. That's a
Yeah.
very classical, liberal position to have. But it's to some people in the more like left leaning space, if I say these things, they might say, "Oh, he's like a free speech kind of maximalist, like right winger
Hmm.
rhetoric that he's espousing." So I would say that that's an area that has kind of challenged me. Also, economically, I mean, I've always kind of thought that you know in the past that like well, a very naive view I had when I was younger was, oh, the reason that we have so many problems in I'm from America, in America is just that the government just doesn't spend more money on social services. So they
Hmm.
don't just tax more. If they only tax people more and they spend more money on these things, we would live in a better place. But once I learned more about economics, I learned about the reality of inflation. You realize that inflation hurts poor people a lot more
Hmm.
than it hurts rich people who already have assets. Their assets are going to, there's a lot of asset inflation and their assets are going to rise. But if you're poor, you have no assets and the government just prints money, like you're going to get hurt the most by inflation.
Yeah.
And this kind of forced me to kind of reconsider that very naive viewpoint I had. Maybe a couple ways.
Yeah. I think I'm really similar on that. Those are probably the big two for me, just coincidentally. I think, what's funny, I think the free speech stuff here in the US, I mean, the world saw it as well, but a lot of it was, with Trump and Twitter, right? So
Hmm.
some of the folks that, people having different sides on, should accounts be banned for certain things? Should, the weight of who they are in the world, prevent them from being banned. The classic left take at the time was like from kind of mainstream left, whether it's journalists or politicians, whatever, saying, okay, well, it's a private company, so that's not infringing on free speech if Twitter wants to ban, which at the end of the day is true. That's why censorship resistant protocols like Nostr I think are really important. And at the time, I think I kind of sided with that, and I did. And people were trying to define, what defines hate speech or inciting violence, like where's the line there with different things, and the stuff we were seeing in the world on January 6th at the Capitol, all of this was very much so. But then I think my conviction month after month has only grown. One, I'm like, us preventing free speech does not prevent those people from necessarily feeling that way, right? It's still like, let's air our
Yeah.
dirty laundry. Like, especially in the US, we never ever do this in great ways. Whether it's honestly, and I did a study abroad in South Africa in college forever ago. And, something the US I think needs is to air its dirty laundry, kind of similar to what South Africa did with the Peace and Reconciliation Council,
Mm-hmm.
and focusing on those things. We haven't aired our dirty laundry just about our history in so many ways. So we're very polite in that way. I think we need to get things out in the open. Like, we need to see the ugly to head towards the light, like as a society, and figure out who we are. If we're preventing free speech, and it really bothers me when people say, "Oh, that's a right wing view" or something like that. It bothers the hell out of me. I'm like, that's freedom. Like, a lot of the progressive values I hold, with
Mm-hmm.
people's right to access to healthcare, with protections for gay people in the US, with all of these things. This is about promoting maximum freedom. And if the government can't enshrine this into law for folks, which I think is very, very progressive, then what are we even doing here? So for me, I'm like, I hate when it's associated with a political party, because I completely agree with you. It's not about moving more right. It's either for everyone, it's for no one. And that's kind of a founding principle of democracy, of liberal views, things like this, that the US is getting into some murky waters with, and the West as well, Europe especially.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I mean, I'm not like too kind of well tuned into like the American stuff, but I've been reading a little bit about, certain courts are like removing him from ballots and
Mhm.
whatnot. And a part of me is just like, this is a very wrong way to go about things,
Yeah.
in my point of view. Like, if you want to have a robust democracy, and like one that people feel that they can trust, is that you don't want to make it overtly feel like somebody's being politically targeted.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe people kind of on the like, I don't know what you call this group, but like the squad type. They used to be called progressives. Is
Yep.
that still what they're called in the US? Like, but
Yeah.
it's very different than like progressive in like um in some other contexts. But like this certain like firebrand
Yeah.
of left wing
Yep. Yeah, in the US,
voices. Yeah.
the larger group of about 100 or so members of the House is the Progressive Caucus. So that would be the
Mm,
far left group in the United States, and the Squad is kind of a smaller part of that Progressive Caucus. So yeah, it's kind of that term is interchangeable um, with them, which is one of the reasons I get a little about the word
yeah.
progressive, because I know what people think, and I have to add some nuance. And if everyone's being honest, though, everyone holds nuanced views, and I think that's the important part, is talking
Yeah, for
about that,
sure.
because we don't all agree on everything as a progressive or member of the left or member of the right. Also, none of that matters. Like, every year that goes by, I care less and less about that. Every month that goes by. But anyway, as you were saying,
No, for sure. No, I think I was just saying that I think that some of the arguments that I hear for like, it's kind of similar to what you brought up about like banning them from Twitter. It's just it doesn't seem like in like the long term health of a country to be in the best interest. You're gonna piss off just a lot of people. You're gonna demoralize a lot of people. You're gonna make them feel like the system is rigged against them, and it's not gonna be helpful.
yeah. And I've been really, really, really disappointed in terms of, the whole time with Trump. One of the biggest arguments was like, okay, we're in a fight for our democracy, right? The amount of times the Democratic establishment in the US, the political party, has said that, it just means less and less over time. Like, fight for our democracy, fight for our democracy. But then now you're doing things that are anti-democratic. Now, they
Yeah,
could be things that people agree with or disagree with. That's someone's opinion, right? But maybe someone's like, oh yeah, I don't want Trump. So yeah, remove him from the ballots. That's great. But at the end of the day, Trump still has not been convicted of those things or charged with insurrection. There's different like laws that are not being adhered to.
Yeah,
even if
exactly.
you're most loosely defining the law that they're trying to draw upon in terms of insurrectionists, which was based on the Civil War, in a lot more extreme environments. It also doesn't apply to presidents. I'm not saying it should or shouldn't. I think in general, not enough is applied to presidents. I think many of our presidents should have been locked up and in prison, including George W. Bush. I think that is so. It's not just about Trump. But if you're in a fight for democracy and then along the way you're being anti-democratic, you're trying to only prop up the current president because you're afraid he's too weak to actually compete with other candidates. I'm sorry, that is not any progressive value, or forget
Hmm.
progressive value. That's just not an American value. That's not anything that I think anyone would side with. Um, and they're in for a rude awakening, in my opinion, in terms of elections. And of course, the last thing on earth I would want is a Trump presidency. I do believe he's a dangerous individual, not like a dangerous for all of these things. It's just in terms of like when Trump was president, we saw a lot of extremists around the world get kind of excited because they're like, he's a loose cannon,
Yeah.
he's a wild cannon, he's not going to hold us accountable. We can do what we want to our populations. Like, not that the U.S. should be a police state, but there's just a lot of unstableness that this man brings as an individual in one of the most important positions in the world. So yeah, that's something I'm a little fearful of. But uh, Democrats engaging in the way they have in the U.S. and just the left in general going along with this, it's not democratic. It's crazy to me. So it's been hard for me to engage, period, with this because I'm like everything in our political system is really messed up. That's probably why most of us find ourselves in Bitcoin in general. But yeah, I'm not too optimistic about that.
Yeah, 100%. And another part of me that's bothered by it is that like these kind of actions that the people are taking, it kind of further gives credence to this kind of rising school of thought that is very anti-democratic, anti-egalitarian. You're seeing it in Europe, you're seeing it in America. It's this view that, oh, democracy has failed, or like, we need a strong man, or whatever
Hmm.
the case may be. When we weaken the institutions, and we play very loose with the laws and restricting candidates, it adds fuel to their arguments, right?
It does.
And it's kind of this like snake eating itself, or this like fire that just keeps fueling itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I felt the same way. And one thing I try to do from this platform, or even just in conversations with folks from the left that I know what they're thinking because I've thought similarly. Like the Canadian trucker protest was a really good example where
Hmm.
I might not agree with maybe some of their stances or some of their views or political views and things like that, but I kept saying like, imagine if it was a cause you cared about. Like,
Exactly.
imagine if they can do it in that instance, they can flip it and do it in another. So we have to think about it. And I would use the example of like, okay, let's say in the US, they get so restrictive on abortion access. They get so restrictive on your access to transitioning healthcare and things like this for trans individuals. And the only way you could raise funds to keep your operation going was through Bitcoin. And they just like they cut off your bank charters, they've cut off your organization's 501(c)(3) status. They've done all of these things at a state and federal level in the US, which are kind of enshrined into law. So it's like they can't, but if you're advocating for them to, you know, freeze bank accounts for those people, why would
Yeah.
they not do the same thing to you if your guy wasn't in office? Like we have to think that way because there's a good chance at this point as we stand today that Trump could be president next time around. A year is a long time in 2024 and in politics, so we'll see what happens. But I'm really encouraging folks, regardless of what your views are, think about one of the things that Bitcoin taught me is like, you know, don't trust, verify. And it's like, think about the
Yeah.
process and systems. It's rules, not rulers. Think about those things. We should not base our way of life on if the person we like is in office. Like, that's why I'm such a big believer in let's enshrine as much as we can into law, like basic protections and freedoms for people. And I happen to take the more progressive view that it should include a lot of gay rights, healthcare rights, abortion access, all of those things that folks might disagree with me on. Start there, but we can't get there yet. So that's the part I'm really frustrated about and concerned about.
Yeah, I think part of what Bitcoin also did is it made me kind of think more about adversarial thinking. And the Canadian
Hmm.
trucker protest, I think, is a really good example where it became almost like political, like
Yeah.
if you were pro or against, depending on your own political view. And that was very short sighted to me. One, because you can make the argument that it's kind of very left wing. These were literally the workers going into the Capitol.
Yeah.
And the union was demanding to speak to them so that they can have the same freedoms that we had here in Sweden and in America. But because they were anti-vax or anti-COVID, immediately it was, oh, they're right wing, not supporting it,
Yep.
not into it. But for what you said, like, how sure are you that, like, you know, they won't freeze the bank accounts of Black Lives Matter activists
Yep.
that are, blocking the intersection in front of the White House,
Yep.
and label them terrorists under that same pretense, right?
Yep.
So we need to think in this kind of way. We can't be short sighted.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, DC police, federal. Actually, it wasn't even. I could be wrong about this. I think it was federal police because Washington D.C. is such an interesting place where the city and local government really doesn't have that much power if the federal government wants to do something in terms of like police force or action. So even if D.C., which especially at the time was very like politically left and still is in terms of like mayor, structure of the city, population of D.C., there were Black Lives Matter protesters, and Trump wanted to go do a photo op like with the Bible in his hand.
Yeah.
And they were shooting cannons. They were just doing massive, like pretty violent action against these protesters to get them off the street. I don't think the DC police were a part of it. Maybe they were a little bit, but it's mostly a federal effort at the direction of Trump in the White House, saying, get these protesters out of here so I could take a photo op with like the Bible. Like, I think it was like upside down or something too. It was so funny.
Yeah.
It was just that's the one thing I do like about him is the photo ops of just his, rendezvous on the streets. Like, it cracked me up. But that's something that I'm like, okay, that is, they shouldn't be able to do that, period. Like, we have to be ruled by founding principles and laws. And the more we go away from that, even if it's for your cause, gosh, that's going to flip so hard every election cycle. That's just how it goes.
Yeah. I worry about that a lot too. Just that, like, there's too much like my side versus their side, and like we're gonna be as punitive as possible.
Yeah.
And if we're in power, they're gonna get the hammer. It's like it's only a matter of time. So this swings back and hits you in the face.
Yeah. Well, the one thing, ending on a hopeful note here, the one thing I'm more hopeful about in general, I think, and this is aside from Bitcoin, but I think the rise of independent journalism, yes, there's been a lot of independent journalism for very right-wing folks, but the rise of independent journalism from folks that are detached from politics or folks that are left-leaning historically and haven't been able to say certain things is making people think more in really good ways. I think a lot of my friends and progressive friends and folks from the left are really disengaged with politics. So in general, a lot of the progressives that I know are not like connected to the Democrat Party or this party or that. They're just kind of like, man, we've seen the same things happening over and over and nothing is changing. So I think there is a lot of momentum when things are ripe for change and realizing we cannot sit and wait for these folks to do something. That's why the importance of building parallel systems like Bitcoin and like other things are really, really important that people can utilize. And so that we can say, we're good. We've got it. We've figured out how to take care of ourselves and how to run things a little bit better than you all. And we don't need you. We don't need you, Wall Street. We don't need you, banks. We don't need you, Joe Biden. We don't doing that. I'm very, very, very hopeful about that going forward. The only way that these things would be jeopardized is if the government and all of these people really got on the same page and really started to do things incredibly well and not spend so much and provide everything for, like, these things just aren't happening, right? It's kind of baked into the understanding that, this shit will keep hitting the fan. That's kind of why these things happen, like bank crises, Wall Street, government, all of this. So I'm very hopeful about people coming together and seeing these things and not being so reliant on those systems because they just have not been working.
Yeah, I think it's important to have like an alternative system, because I don't think you can. I mean, this is probably like a separate conversation we don't have to go down, but like it's hard to say whether or not you can reform the existing one, or if that's a fight that you want to have, or if you'd rather just build an alternative one in parallel
Yeah.
that is better. Or yeah.
I think I've started to take that point of view from hearing from many people that are way smarter than me and have been in Bitcoin or in so many different things, journalism, Occupy protesters, Black Lives Matter protesters, like being inspired by people that are building a parallel system. And so that people just naturally gravitate towards it. And they're like, oh, this is working better. We're going to see what this is like. It's very, it's just kind of comical. A lot of it is kind of like satire of like, you guys are like not getting your shit together. Like we're gonna go with Bitcoin. Like these guys, this is working. We're gonna use that. So I think that's very cool. last question for you on that topic, in terms of like Sweden and the West. Do you feel similarly to that? Do you feel that we could be ripe for things? Because I think, there in the US, there's a lot of regulation on like privacy and money, but I know Europe, I think, is a little bit ahead of us on European Central Bank, on CBDCs, on a little bit of these privacy takes, things like that. So it's a bit more in your face, I think, or a little bit more advanced. In the US and Europe are working so closely together on all of this, right? But for you, do you hold the same optimism in that? Whereas kind of your your fear metric on some of these things?
Yeah, I mean, I hold tremendous optimism. I'm not that fearful of CBDCs. I just think that one, Sweden is already basically a CBDC society. It's one of the most cashless societies on
Yeah.
the planet, and people have no problem with it for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. They have a high trust in government, and for the most part, their government and their leaders are responsible, and the system really works. So for them, financial privacy is just not relevant. So a CBDC would have like no impact on the Swedes. But I think that what it also will do, and I hope what it will do is it'll show that Bitcoin is the polar opposite of a CBDC in many ways. For the people that, for a lot of people, a CBDC will be a problem, and it will be used as a tool to infringe on people's freedoms. Especially, you can imagine some more dictatorial leaders, using this tool in nefarious ways. And I think that what that'll do is that'll show people like, hey, there is an alternative that is being built for 15 years, that is robust, that is designed so that nobody can basically censor you, or nobody can track you in the same ways that a CBDC potentially can. So I hope that what it will do is it'll serve as something. It will make Bitcoin serve as a very stark contrast to the CBDC, which I hope will get people to look at it a little bit more.
Yeah. And everything is good for Bitcoin. I usually don't
Yeah,
like to say
as the
those
saying
blanket
goes.
statements, those catchphrases, but sometimes like, that one, sometimes, again, you're exposing that system and it's going to cause people to turn more. If either through incompetence, because someone's account might be accidentally frozen or something
Yeah.
doesn't work, right? Or because for more nefarious reasons, or because, this transaction used that keyword and no, it's closed, right? Just people not working. So my hope is that either through this podcast and so many efforts, like the concept of freedom of speech, freedom of transaction, privacy, be viewed less and less as a like a political party type thing or a political ideology. It's political in the sense of you have rulers that are against that, but it should not be an ideological difference. It should be like more people just want freedom to do as they wish and to be who they are and to feel safe in their society to be and do that, as long as they are not directly harming someone else in a most extreme case, right? Not the, potential or that is a harmful feeling or thing you said, but, having people feel safe. That I hope will be less and less of an ideological thing. And I mean, the height of that has been the past couple of years and in my context and seeing things in the US. So my hope, even beyond Bitcoin, is we move to that place.
Yeah, same.
Yeah. Well, Erik, I'm glad we talked about so many of these different things. I didn't know which way we'd go in some of this conversation towards the end, but I really enjoyed it. Where can people, follow, support you, support your work? I know you've got like, your website and the projects you're working on in Twitter, but where can folks follow along and, engage with you?
Yeah, I mean, Twitter is probably the place that you can kind of keep up with my daily updates on the stuff that I'm working on and daily thoughts. So it's UX Erik _ You can also go to my website to find my Nostr. I never memorize my NPub. I never know how to direct people to my Nostr.
Yeah.
It's connected to my NIP5, so maybe you can search Erik at uierik.com, but I'm not sure.
Usually I put it in the show notes too. If someone's even remotely, so it'll be in the show notes for people to reach out. Yeah.
Yeah, if not, my NPub is on my website. And if you're interested in cashu, I recommend going to cashu.space, CASHU.space, for the protocol documentation and to learn more about the different wallets that are out there and how it's used. because I think that eCash has a very, very bright future on Bitcoin.
Yeah, I agree with that. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Really enjoyed the conversation. And folks, be sure to check out Erik's work. You're an awesome designer. I love your stuff.
Oh, thanks, man.
So much. I think you're doing so much good stuff, and excited to see the year ahead.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun one, man. Thanks for having me. It's been nice chatting.
Yeah, absolutely.